an education lawyer has to be well-versed in pretty much every area of the law to some respects. We are I call myself the general counsel for a lot of little mini corporations. So you have to know how to do a whole gambit of things in addition to just the education law. So, if you're in law school, make sure you're taking a broad swath of topics, including things like contracts and employment law and those types of things, because you will be being torn in a million different directions in terms of what you're practicing.
Welcome to On Record PR. I'm your host, Gina Rubel. Today, I'm going on record with Patricia Hennessy, a partner at Barton Gilman. She is co-chair of the firm's education law group and an education reform activist and advocate. You will find more information about Pat on our website in the show notes from this podcast. So let's get right to it. Welcome, Pat.
Great. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
I'm so happy to have you on, and I look forward to learning more about what you do. Can you tell us a little bit about what attracted you to education reform and the education reform movement?
Yeah, that's a great question. So honestly, I think most of the attraction really came from the fact that, my mom essentially raised, 4 kids in a Philadelphia row home. 4 kids, 3 bedrooms, do the math. And she really placed a really great importance on education. And, I didn't realize at the time the amount of sacrifice that took. We went to essentially K-12 schools in the archdiocesan system. But she produced, 4 very learned and successful children because she placed such an emphasis on education. So that's what really attracted me to work in the field and to recognize that there are kids out there that really just never had that chance and didn't have those types of supports or didn't have those opportunities. And that's what's drawn me to this movement and drawn me to education reform.
Well, Pat, I have to ask you off the cuff, where did you grow up in Philadelphia?
So I grew up in the Wissinoming section in Northeast Philadelphia.
Okay. So what high school?
I went to Nazareth Academy.
Okay. I'm a St. Maria Goretti graduate.
Thanks.
So I know what it's like to grow up in that. Ours was a 3-bedroom row home, 16 by 19. Again, do the math, right?
Yep, exactly.
I get where you're coming from. So what are some of the misconceptions about the types of schools that you represent? And I believe some of them are charter schools and private schools.
Yeah, so I say that the majority of my work probably centers in the charter school movement, and we fight against the stigma of, that we are, a group of individuals that want to loot the public school system for, a private entity, that we fail students, that we don't take the hardest to educate students. And, and by and large, that narrative doesn't work. I mean, charter schools are formed as public nonprofit entities. So there's nobody that's profiting off of the opening of a charter school. Particularly in Philadelphia, charter schools do take some of the hardest hit kids, traditionally disadvantaged students, kids that are in poverty, African Americans who have really always, kind of really been cut short in terms of what they've been given in the educational realm. So, we do serve all of the hardest hit kids, and we really are just another jewel in the crown, if you will, in terms of educational options for parents. We continually fight that type of narrative repeatedly in terms of what we do, how we do it, and what we bring to the table in terms of equity.
And do you also represent private schools, or is it predominantly charter?
It's predominantly charter. I do work with private schools. I work with the Archdiocese of Philadelphia in their school system as well. And those challenges are somewhat the same. I mean, it's those institutions are also, attempting to educate kids in the way that is the best way for those kids to be educated. And, again, in the city of Philadelphia, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia in particular has really been a stalwart in providing education to kids as well as to disadvantaged kids, in the city.
And when we talk about private schools, just to be clear for our audience, and you mentioned the Archdiocese, they're private parochial, correct?
Correct. Right.
So what does that actually mean?
So, the Archdiocese of Philadelphia is essentially, that's 5 counties of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So those are religious schools run under the auspices of the Archdiocese of Philadelphia and the Catholic Church. Private schools generally cover the gamut as well. I mean, you have some obviously very Tony type of schools. And then you have other schools that are opening and trying to help, disadvantaged kids as well. But again, I like to support all of the options that kids can have, not just the traditional public school district, which, by the way, also requires our support as well. I mean, we're all trying to row the oar in the same direction. So I don't favor one over the other, but, we're all part of the same continuum.
Well, it's interesting. And the reason I asked you that question, the only reason I knew to ask that question is because I went to an archdiocese high school. So, it's important that our listeners understand that. But also as a parent, I never really understood until I was a parent that all students don't learn equally and that there are different types of schools that support the type of education, just like there are different types of food options that support one's individual health needs. And so it's really interesting that you share it the way you do and that there are so many options for today's learning environment. So I appreciate what you do. What's the hardest part about practicing education law?
Well, I think it's twofold. From a professional level, I think when you talk to other lawyers, it's like, oh, education law, that's adorable. You know, it's little kids, it's little chairs, and it's love and lollipops and happiness. But that's not really what it's like to work as a school law lawyer. You deal with really difficult topics. Particularly we see the ugly parts of schools. I had a client just recently comment to me, like, they deal with ugliness, but by and large, their job has a lot of other factions to it, but that's all I ever see. And so, I think that that's the hardest part when you see kids being mistreated or, just the struggles that some families have when they're trying to do the best by their kids. That's really hard to take sometimes.
So tell me a little bit about the day in a life of an education lawyer. What are some of those issues without going into anything that is privileged, of course, but I would guess it could be anything from child abuse to policies, right?
Yeah, I always say I wake up every single day with a to-do list that I never get to because it's sort of cyclical. So like it starts in the morning with what do I call the car line questions, things that happen that the administrator comes back in and, there's things that are bubbling in the morning that are hard. And those things can be, this kid showed up to school today and he's covered with bruises and he's bleeding. Clearly something happened either on the way to school or at the home or whatever. Now we have to deal with that particular issue. We could have a situation where a kid, because there's a disability involved, doesn't know how to regulate themselves, and the school is now sort of trying to deal with that. And that's difficult. Sometimes you have very, very difficult parents, that you need to deal with. Sometimes you have very, very difficult employees. So it really covers the gambit on what you can see on a daily basis. But I really do try to root my practice in what's the best thing to do for a child here and get everybody on the same page in terms of what we need to do for those kids. And that's even for things that really don't seem like they have a connection to kids at the moment. Is there a teacher that's just not holding up their end of the bargain, right? So at the end of the day, that's not serving kids. So, we need to deal with that teacher one way or the other. It's either, increasing the training, doing something different, or moving them onto a different position. So again, it really can cover the gambit on the types of things that you deal with.
Sounds like a true calling. Pat, we're going to pause here for a message from our sponsor and we'll be right back.
Great.
This episode is brought to you by Furia Rubel Communications, a public relations and marketing agency serving law firms and businesses internationally. With an expert team of professionals positioned throughout the U.S. and supported by international affiliates, Furia Rubel enhances its clients' brands through integrated communications by providing expert guidance in crisis management and high-profile litigation, protecting brand and reputation, and supporting internal marketing teams with media relations, media and crisis training, and client and talent acquisition and retention. To learn more, visit furiarubel.com.
Welcome back, Pat, and our listeners. We're talking about education law, which sounds like a calling, a true calling, and you certainly have to have passion. Can you envision a time when there will be more civil discourse on education reform?
I hope so. I really do. I do think that there were some really great opportunities during the pandemic that, did start the conversation out on the right foot. I do have to say that, it didn't maintain itself, but that gave me some level of hope. A lot of schools were trying to work together in terms of how do we serve kids now? How are you opening today? Or what are we doing? Or, we get together as groups and actually have conversations. I do think that watching that gave me hope. What didn't give me hope were things like, the cyber charter schools, which I work with. That's if we were having remote learning, that would be the perfect opportunity to reach out to those types of schools and say, hey, how is it that you do this? And by and large, no one really wanted to tap for that level of expertise that they do have in that arena. But I do think it's going to change as time goes on. It all boils down to funding. That's what really creates the bad dialogue that happens. And that's both at the federal and state levels, and even sometimes down to the local. There's a limited pot of money. And, people need to understand that, again, we've had this huge Commonwealth Court ruling that talks about 796 pages worth of stuff about the constitutionality of what we provide in terms of education funding. And it really boiled down to two words in that entire thing, which was money matters. But money matters to all schools, not just traditional public schools. It matters to every single school that's trying to try to educate kids.
It's such a big topic, and I know I can talk to you for hours, but we don't have hours. So what advice do you have for young attorneys or law students who might be interested in education law?
Well, that's a great question. I mean, I see a growing number of law students and recent graduates that are actually getting interested in working in education law. And that also gives me a great deal of hope. I would suggest to them that they start to do things like go to your local school board meeting. If you live in that district, you have the public access to go in to see what those things look like, and you see the types of topics that folks are talking about. Get involved on a volunteer board of any school, a private school, charter school, whatever those may be. And that will also give you sort of an insider view of what a school board deals with, regardless of the types of education that they deliver. And again, an education lawyer has to be well-versed in pretty much every area of the law to some respects. We are I call myself the general counsel for a lot of little mini corporations. So you have to know how to do a whole gambit of things in addition to just the education law. So, if you're in law school, make sure you're taking a broad swath of topics, including things like contracts and employment law and those types of things, because you will be being torn in a million different directions in terms of what you're practicing.
Well, it doesn't sound like you ever get bored.
No, absolutely not.
Well, Pat, this has been a wonderful conversation. There's so many things I want to ask. We might have to save that for another day, but I want to thank you for your time today. And I want to thank our listeners for turning in to On Record PR. I want to ask them to visit our website, onrecordpr.com, subscribe to the show, share it with friends and colleagues, check out our show notes, and give us a review on your favorite podcast platform. As always, we welcome guests, topics, and ideas, which can be emailed to podcast@onrecordpr.com. And feel free to send in any questions you might have for Pat, and we'll pass them along. We'll see you next time.
On Record PR is produced by Jennifer Simpson-Carr and Matt Henderson, with support from the team at Furia Rubel Communications. This episode is edited by Željko Tomic of Compost Media Flow.